I want to begin with a date that should mean nothing: 1820, the year Antarctica entered the official record. The year 3 separate expeditions, British, American, Russian, all operating independently, we're told, all arrived at the world's most remote continent within months of each other. For decades, I never questioned that timing. It was simply history, a footnote in exploration timelines. But then I started noticing the gap: 4 years. Just 4 years separating Antarctica's discovery from the most catastrophic atmospheric event in recorded human history. And once you see that gap, once you really see it, you can't look away. Before we go any further, I need to briefly return to something I covered in the last video in this series, and if you haven't seen it, I'll link it below because what follows won't carry its full weight without that foundation. In that episode, I explored what mainstream history calls the year without a summer, 1816, the year following the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, which according to the official record ejected enough ash into the atmosphere to lower global temperatures, destroy harvests across the northern hemisphere, kill livestock, trigger famine from New England to northern Europe, and turn summer into literal winter. Tambora, a single volcano. The explanation is tidy, the timeline is clean. But then I started pulling on threads that didn't belong to that story. Because here's what the official account doesn't explain: the uniformity, the sheer sweeping, continent-spanning simultaneity of the collapse. Crop failures weren't regional. They were global. Reports of unnatural cold, of snow in June, of orange and purple sunsets. They weren't clustered near Indonesia. They were everywhere at once, and not just environmentally, socially, politically. The years immediately following 1816 saw a cascade of institutional ruptures, population displacements, and what one researcher I came across described as civilizational amnesia. Entire communities that seemed to lose continuity with what came before. In that video, I proposed something that I know made a lot of you uncomfortable, and good. It should. I proposed that the year without a summer was not a volcanic event, or more precisely that it may not have been only a volcanic event, that the atmospheric disruption of 1816 bore the hallmarks of something more catastrophic, more deliberate, something closer in its signature to what we would today recognize as a nuclear winter, a sudden, total atmospheric blackout, not from a mountain, but from a civilization-ending event, a reset, the kind of event that would leave behind not just climate data, but erasure, the kind of event now loosely associated with the hypothesis that before the 19th century there existed a global Old World civilization, sophisticated, architecturally advanced, connected across continents, what we have come to call, provisionally, Tartaria, not an empire in the conventional sense, not a country with borders on a modern map, something harder to define, a presence, a civilization whose fingerprints are visible everywhere once you learn to recognize them, in the architecture, in the canal systems, in the city grids that appear fully formed in the historical record without any construction documentation, without any scaffolding period, without any of the messy incremental archaeology that should accompany human settlement. And then, apparently, it was simply gone. We covered all of that. But there was one detail I kept circling back to, one date I kept setting aside because it felt almost too convenient, too perfectly placed. The date Antarctica was discovered, 1820, 4 years after the year without a summer. I want you to hold that gap in your mind. 4 years, not a generation, not a century. 4 years after what may have been the most catastrophic atmospheric event in recorded human history. An event that, if my previous analysis holds, may have functioned as the final act of a global civilizational collapse. An event where the entire world experienced freezing simultaneously, and then the world's most remote, most inaccessible, most sealed, most frozen landmass is suddenly officially discovered, and not by one expedition, by 3. Simultaneously, a British crew, an American crew, a Russian crew, all operating independently, we're told, all in the same region, all within months of each other, all in 1820. Now, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that's impossible. People chase discoveries, expeditions overlap, competition drives exploration. I understand all of that, but I want to ask a different kind of question, not whether it happened. But why then? Why, after millennia of human civilization, after the Phoenicians and the Greeks and the Romans and the Chinese and every sophisticated maritime culture that ever put a hull to open water, Why does the largest landmass south of the equator remain entirely undiscovered, undocumented and unnamed until 4 years after the world's sky went dark? Why then? Because here's where the conventional account starts to develop cracks. The further I went into the cartographic record, and I mean deep, into archives that don't get cited in introductory history courses, the more the 1820 discovery date began to look less like a beginning and more like a cover story. There are maps, actual surviving, historically documented maps that show Antarctica long before 1820. The Piri Reis Map, dated 1513, drawn by an Ottoman admiral who explicitly stated he was compiling it from older source maps, shows a southern landmass with a detailed, accurate coastline. Not a vague blob, not a speculative fringe, a charted coastline that, when researchers in the 20th century overlaid it against modern satellite imaging of the subglacial terrain, the actual rock beneath 2 miles of ice, aligned with a precision that no one has adequately explained. The Orontius Phineas map from 1531 goes further. It depicts Antarctica without ice, with river systems, with mountain ranges, with internal geographic features that we only confirmed existed using mid-20th century sonar technology. Let me say that again more slowly, because I think it's easy to read past it. A map drawn in 1531 shows geographic features of Antarctica that humanity did not technologically confirm until the 1950s. The official explanation breaks down almost immediately under the weight of that sentence. The academic response has historically been coincidence, lucky extrapolation, or the suggestion that ancient cartographers were simply guessing at a southern landmass for philosophical and geometric reasons, symmetry, balance, the idea that the north must be matched by the south. And maybe that's true, maybe it is coincidence. But how do you guess a river? How do you guess subglacial mountain ridges? How do you guess a coastline with enough accuracy that it survives comparison to satellite data 5 centuries later? You don't guess that. You don't theorize that. You map it from observation, from presence, from knowledge that was either first-hand or inherited from someone who was there. And that raises a question that the mainstream record has never satisfyingly answered. Who was there? If you're finding this worth your time, and I hope you are, consider subscribing or becoming a YouTube member. This series goes places that most channels won't touch, and having you along for it means everything. Now, back to Antarctica, because we're just getting started. I want to return to 1816 for a moment, because I think we've been looking at it from the wrong angle. In the previous video, I laid out the case that the atmospheric event of 1816, whatever its true cause, may have functioned as the terminal moment of an old world civilization. The event that ended something. The nuclear winter that followed what may have been a civilization-scale catastrophe, leaving behind depopulated cities, orphaned infrastructure, and a historical record so thin it barely qualifies as a record at all. But what if that framing is only partially correct? What if 1816 was not just an ending? What if it was also, for someone, a beginning? Here is the theory I've been sitting with, and I want to be clear that I am presenting this as a question, not a conclusion. What if the atmospheric event of 1816, whatever generated it, was capable not only of disrupting the Northern Hemisphere's climate, but of accelerating glaciation at the poles? What if the same mechanism that turned summer to winter across Europe and North America also, in some compounding way, drove ice formation southward? What if Antarctica, the ice-free continent visible on 16th century maps, was in the process of freezing, or had recently been frozen, and 1816 was either the final phase of that process or a deliberate rehearsal of it? I know that's a significant claim, and I'm not making it as a claim, I'm making it as a shape, a pattern of timing and geography and suppression that I cannot stop thinking about, because consider what comes next. 1816. The sky goes dark. A global atmospheric event of unprecedented scope disrupts civilization. 1820. Antarctica is discovered. Officially entered into the record. Named, catalogued, claimed. Not before, not during, after. 4 years after. The pattern appears, and once you notice it, you cannot unfocus your eyes from it. Stay with the timeline, because it doesn't stop at 1820. The same thread, the maps, the knowledge, the carefully preserved secret of what Antarctica actually is, keeps surfacing, decades later, in the hands of people who had every resource in the world to go and look. 1946, 1 year after the end of World War II, the United States Navy launches Operation High Jump, a full military expedition to Antarctica, Not a research team, not a small exploratory vessel. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, nearly 5,000 military personnel, led by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, one of the most decorated naval officers in American history. The stated objective was scientific mapping, research, establishing a base, and maybe that's all it was. But here's the part that makes the timing impossible to set aside, because the Americans were not the first military power to take Antarctica seriously, not even close. In 1938, 7 years before High Jump, Nazi Germany launched its own Antarctic expedition. The Schwabenland expedition. They mapped nearly 600,000 square kilometres of territory, dropped thousands of marker stakes to assert territorial claim, and reportedly returned with something that shifted internal priorities at the highest levels. What exactly? We're not told. The records are incomplete in the specific way that records tend to be when the answer matters. What we do know is that German submarines were documented operating in Antarctic waters as late as 1945, and that certain senior figures in the Nazi scientific apparatus had a known, documented obsession with ancient knowledge, lost civilizations, prehistory, inherited cartographic traditions that supposedly predated the modern world. The same maps, the same thread, which brings us back to the custodian problem, the Piri Reis Map, the Orontius Phineas map. The Admiral himself stated he compiled those charts from older sources that are never named, never located, never accounted for. Someone held that knowledge. Some chain of hands preserved it across centuries, across the 1816 rupture, intact enough for multiple parties, an Ottoman admiral, a Nazi expedition, an American naval fleet to apparently follow it to the same place. Who were they? And what did all three find when they got there? The evidence doesn't answer that, but it doesn't dismiss it either. Now, I want to talk about what we're not allowed to do, because this is the part of the Antarctica conversation that most people skip past, and I think it's the most important part. You cannot freely go to Antarctica. I want to be precise about this because the casual response is, of course you can. Expeditions go there all the time, and yes they do. Scientific expeditions, government-sanctioned research missions, tourism even, in limited and highly supervised forms. I'm not saying the continent is surrounded by an invisible wall. What I'm saying is this: the Antarctic Treaty System, signed in 1959 and now ratified by over 50 nations, designates Antarctica as a scientific preserve and prohibits, explicitly prohibits, military activity, mineral extraction, and nuclear testing on the continent. And in practice, it means that independent, unsupervised exploration of the Antarctic interior is essentially impossible. Not illegal exactly, just practically impossible. You need logistical support that only governments and large institutions can provide. You need permissions that are quietly difficult to obtain for anything outside of approved research parameters. You need infrastructure that does not exist for the independent traveller. The result is that Antarctica is functionally the one place on Earth that the ordinary citizen of the 21st century simply cannot go and look around. And I want to ask, why does that feel normal to us? Every other landmass on the planet, every mountain range, every jungle, every desert, can be accessed by a motivated individual with enough resources and determination. People climb Everest recreationally. People cross the Sahara alone. People sail to the most remote islands on Earth with nothing but a small boat and a compass. But Antarctica has a treaty. 50 nations signed in the same decade that sonar technology first confirmed what was hiding under the ice. And we don't find that remarkable. We nod along. We accept that the treaty is about science, about peace, about environmental preservation. Maybe it is. But the evidence suggests that simultaneous global agreement is extraordinarily rare. Nations do not agree on almost anything. They disagree about borders, about resources, about ideology, about language, about everything. The 20th century was practically defined by national disagreement. Except here, on this, about this one place. The coordination problem becomes impossible to ignore the longer you sit with it. 50 nations, all agreeing, all signing, all maintaining consistently for decades about a frozen continent that officially contains nothing but ice and penguins. What is it about ice and penguins that requires an international treaty? Let me tell you about the architecture problem, because this is where the Tartaria connection stops being abstract. Across this series, we've documented, imperfectly, provisionally, but documented, the presence of old-world construction techniques in places they have no business being. Buildings that appear in the historical record fully complete, without construction phases. Civic infrastructure in cities supposedly founded in the early 19th century that would have required decades and resources that those young settlements simply did not have. Cathedrals in frontier towns, elaborate sewer systems in cities that were, by official record, wilderness 5 years before the systems were installed, the mud flood evidence, the buried ground floors, the windows that begin below what is now street level, because the street level has risen, or because something came down and covered what was already there. This pattern repeats across North America, across Europe, across Russia, across South America. It is not regional, it is not isolated, it is global, and every time we document it, the official explanation involves either dismissal or a kind of casual hand-waving that, the deeper you look, dissolves on contact with the actual evidence. The transition periods are missing, the documentation is thin, the workforce that supposedly built these structures is unaccounted for, the supply chains don't exist, the timelines don't work. Something was already there. Something was built by someone who came before. Now, Antarctica. We know from the cartographic evidence, from the ice-free maps, from the subglacial topography, that Antarctica was, at some point in historical time, a habitable landmass. Not geologically ancient, historically recent. Recent enough that human beings mapped it. Recent enough that those maps survived into the 16th century, copied from even older sources. What was on that continent? What is under 2 miles of ice right now? I'm not saying there are pyramids under the Antarctic ice sheet, though there are structures in the Ellsworth Mountains that have generated genuine academic debate about their geometry. I'm not saying there is a lost city sealed under the Ross Ice Shelf. I'm asking something simpler, and I think more important. Why don't we know? Why, in 2025, with ground-penetrating radar technology, capable of imaging geological features thousands of meters below the surface, with satellite systems that can read a license plate from orbit, with the full weight of the most technologically advanced civilization in recorded history pointed at every corner of the Earth, why is the subglacial topography of Antarctica still largely unmapped at high resolution? Why do the gaps in the data cluster in the interior? Why does the silence persist? The silence, when you start listening for it, is everywhere in this story. No serious mainstream academic discussion of the Piri Reis Map in introductory curricula. No, it's a footnote, if it appears at all. No serious institutional inquiry into the coordination problem of 1820. 3 independent expeditions arriving simultaneously at an undiscovered continent. Convergence, coincidence, moving on. No institutional curiosity about the gap between the ice-free maps of the 16th century and the frozen wasteland we officially discovered in the 19th. No explanation for how, if the ice built up over geological time as we're told, human cartographers produced maps showing the uniced terrain in historical time. The silence isn't accidental. Silence on this scale, across this many disciplines, maintained for this long. That's not absence of evidence. That's a shape, and that shape suggests something. I'm not going to tell you what it suggests. I think you already feel it. I want to close with something that has been sitting with me since I first started pulling this thread. If we accept, provisionally, carefully, with all appropriate skepticism, that there existed before the 19th century a global civilization of significant sophistication, if we accept that this civilization left behind infrastructure, maps, architectural techniques, and knowledge that our official history cannot account for, if we accept that the events of 1816 represented, in some form, the terminal convulsion of that civilization, a collapse so total and so violent that it left atmospheric scars visible across the northern hemisphere, and if we accept that Antarctica, the last unmapped and ice-free landmass on those older charts, was sealed, frozen, treaty-locked, and quietly removed from public access in the years immediately following, then we have to ask the hardest question. What were they protecting? Not from us, necessarily. Maybe from time, maybe from chaos, maybe simply from the kind of casual, uncoordinated, uncontrolled discovery that might have happened if anyone with a ship and curiosity could sail down and start digging. What knowledge was stored there? What records? What architecture? What evidence of a civilization that we have been, through some combination of catastrophe, deliberate erasure, and institutional incuriosity, prevented from knowing? I don't have the answer. I want to be honest with you about that. I have been sitting with these questions for months, and they have not resolved. They have only deepened. The further I go into the record, the more I find, not answers but structure, the shape of something deliberately obscured, something whose outlines I can trace without being able to see its face. Once you see that structure, you cannot unfocus your eyes from it. An atmospheric catastrophe in 1816, unprecedented in its scope and duration. An official continent discovered 4 years later by 3 nations at once, sealed by 50 nations a century after that. Ancient maps that show what's under the ice, a historical record that goes silent at precisely the moments where continuity should exist. Architecture without builders, cities without origins, a civilization without a gravestone, and a continent, renamed, restricted, ice-covered, and quietly held just out of reach, that may contain, under 2 miles of frozen silence, the answer to all of it. Maybe, or maybe not. But I can't stop thinking about the number 1820, and I don't think you will either. Now, if this series is worth something to you, consider commenting your thoughts or your theories below. The next video goes somewhere I wasn't sure I was ready to go. I think I am now. See you there.